She was sold before sunrise. No farewell, no explanation. Just Alpha Caleb Blackthorn's seal pressed into cream-colored wax at the bottom of a document that transferred her life to another pack the way you transfer ownership of land. Official, bloodless, and without once consulting the land itself. Justina cried during the first hour of the journey. By the second hour she stopped, because something ancient was waking inside her. Something that had slept beneath her skin her entire life. Something that didn't cry. Something that didn't wait. Something that had simply been patient, the way old power is always patient, until the moment it was finally needed. When Caleb understood what he had given away, the kingdom would already be kneeling before her. It is always already too late. The transfer order was on the bed when she woke. Justina saw it before she saw anything else, before the grey pre-dawn light pressing through the heavy curtains, before she registered the cold emptiness of the room, the absence of warmth, the silence that sat too still to be accidental. Just the envelope, cream-coloured, sealed. Her name written across the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Her stomach dropped before her mind caught up. She sat up slowly, reached for it. Her fingers didn't shake. That surprised her later when she thought about it, that her hands had been so steady while everything else inside her was already coming apart. The way a body sometimes goes quiet right before it breaks, a last mercy, a final breath before the plunge. She broke the seal. Read it once, read it again. You are hereby transferred to the custody of Alpha Rowan Ashwood of the Nightfall Pack, pursuant to alliance agreement dated the 3rd day of the harvest moon. Departure is at 4 o'clock in the morning. Your belongings have been arranged. This transfer is final and binding under the laws of the Crescent Kingdom. No signature from Caleb, just the Silver Fang Pack seal, stamped at the bottom, cold and official, the kind of stamp used on property deeds, on territorial maps, on anything that didn't have a voice worth consulting. Transferred. She turned the word over slowly in her mind, the way you turn a stone in a riverbed, looking for something softer underneath, something human, some evidence that the man who had pressed that seal into wax had paused, even for a single breath, and felt something. There was nothing softer underneath. Justina set the letter down on the nightstand with great care, as though it were made of something fragile. She wasn't sure what she was protecting. Her composure, maybe. The last thin wall between her chest and the years she had spent behind it. She stood, walked to the narrow window. The courtyard below was already busy in the way it only ever was before something irreversible. 2 servants she recognized were loading a wagon with trunks she also recognized. Her trunks, her mother's old traveling chest, the small wooden box of healing herbs she kept on the windowsill of her room. Someone had already been inside while she slept. Someone had decided what she would carry into her next life and packed it without her. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass. He didn't even wake me. That was the part that broke something in her chest. Not the transfer itself. She had spent enough years in this pack understanding exactly how little Omegas were consulted about their own futures. It was the silence. The deliberate, careful silence of a man who had made a decision and then left before he had to watch her receive it. Cowardice dressed as practicality. She had loved him anyway. For years she had loved him anyway. Before we continue, a huge shout out to Susan Lippert for becoming the newest member of the channel. Thank you so much for your support. It truly means a lot and helps me keep bringing you more stories. And if you're enjoying the content and would like to support the channel while getting exclusive perks, consider joining the membership and becoming part of our growing family. She dressed alone. There were no servants sent to help her this time. Perhaps Caleb had not that far ahead, or perhaps he had simply assumed she would manage. She had always managed. That was the problem with being the kind of woman who managed quietly. People eventually stopped noticing the weight of what you were carrying. She braided her red curls back from her face with steady hands and did not look at herself in the mirror when she was done. The hall outside her room was empty when she stepped into it, her small leather bag over one shoulder, her mother's box tucked beneath her arm. The stone floors were cold through the thin soles of her slippers. She had forgotten to pack her boots where she could reach them easily. A small, ridiculous thing to notice. She noticed it anyway. Caleb was waiting in the courtyard. She had not expected that. Something in her chest moved when she saw him, a reflex, old and embarrassing, the echo of every morning she had watched him cross this same courtyard and felt her heart do something foolish. She pressed it down. He looked like a man who had not slept. Dark circles beneath grey eyes. His jaw was set in that way he had when he'd already decided something and was daring the world to argue with him. He was wearing his alpha coat, the heavy black one with the silver clasps, as though the formality of it would make this easier. It didn't make it easier. Justina, her name in his mouth. Just that. Not "I'm sorry," not "I need you to understand." Just her name, clipped and careful, like a door being held barely open. She stopped a few feet from him. The wagon was directly behind her. She could feel the strangers waiting, two of Nightfall's men, standing quietly beside the horses, not looking at her the way Silverfang wolves weren't looking at her. All of them finding something else to study. The cobblestones, the torchlight, anything. "You could have told me yourself," she said. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm telling you now. You're not telling me anything." Her voice was quieter than she intended. "You're watching me leave." Something crossed his face. She had spent years learning to read him, learning the small shifts behind that carefully controlled expression, the places where the real Caleb lived when he wasn't being the alpha. For 1/2 second, something broke the surface. Then it was gone. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Justina looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the mornings she had brought meals to injured pack members because no one else remembered. All the children whose names she knew. All the times she had waited, quietly and without complaint, for him to look at her the way the moon goddess had always promised he would. She thought about the envelope on the bed, the seal, the handwriting that wasn't his because he had sent someone else to write her name. "Goodbye, Caleb," she said. She didn't cry. Not yet. She saved that for later. For the first hour on the road, when the gates of Silverfang had disappeared, behind the tree line and no one important could see her, the wagon doors closed, and in the darkness with her wrists loosely bound according to pack transfer law, something beneath her skin began to stir, something old, something patient, something that had been waiting a very long time for the moment she finally stopped waiting for him. The Crescent Kingdom was the largest werewolf territory in the north. For centuries, it had been ruled by the descendants of the first alpha, but legend spoke of something older, a bloodline, a queen, a prophecy the powerful had spent generations trying to forget. They were about to remember. The road to Nightfall took most of the day. Justina spent the first hour of it crying quietly in the corner of the wagon, her forehead tipped against the rough wooden wall, watching the grey dawn bleed slowly into pale morning light through the gaps in the slats. She cried without sound. She had learned that a long time ago, how to grieve without making noise, how to fall apart in a way that didn't inconvenience anyone. By the second hour, she stopped, not because the pain had passed, but because something underneath it had shifted, a quiet pressure building in her sternum, low and steady, like the first tremor before an earthquake that hasn't decided yet how large it wants to be. She pressed her hand flat against her chest and held it there until the feeling settled. She watched the world change through the slats instead. The landscape shifted somewhere past the northern border markers, gradually at first, then all at once. The open flatlands of Silverfang territory gave way to something older, denser. The trees grew taller here, their canopies so thick the afternoon light came through in scattered coins of gold rather than broad sheets. Moss covered everything, bark, stone, the old boundary markers carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The air smelled different too, cooler, cleaner, like rain that had fallen somewhere deep in the forest and never quite dried. She had never been this far north. It felt strangely, like somewhere she had been before. The gates of Nightfall were nothing like Silverfang's. Silverfang's entrance was built to intimidate, high iron, sharp points, guards stationed at deliberate intervals to remind you exactly what kind of pack was watching you arrive. Power made visible, strength performed. Nightfall's gates were old stone, wide open and unguarded. Not because they were careless. She understood that immediately, the way you understand certain things without being told. The wolves she could see moving through the tree line on either side of the road were relaxed, unhurried, but they were there, watching without posturing, secure enough not to need the theater of it. The wagon rolled to a stop in a wide courtyard ringed by lanterns that were already lit against the coming dusk. Stone buildings, warm light in the windows. Somewhere nearby, she could hear children. She hadn't expected children. The wagon door opened from the outside. Justina Voss. She stepped down onto the cobblestones and looked up. Alpha Rowan Ashwood was not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared herself for someone like Caleb, commanding, controlled, the particular kind of handsome that comes packaged with the absolute certainty that the room belongs to you. She had prepared herself to be assessed, evaluated, filed away into whatever category an alpha of a rival pack assigned to an omega he had just acquired through a debt agreement. Rowan Ashwood was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not appraisal, not possession, something quieter than either of those. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed plainly for an alpha. Dark coat, no ceremonial markings, no deliberate display of rank. His eyes were the color of deep forest shadow, steady in the way that very calm people are steady, the kind of stillness that comes from having nothing to prove. He didn't smile the way powerful men smile at people they've just acquired. He just looked at her, really looked, the way almost no one in Silverfang ever had, and said simply, "You've had a long journey. Come inside." He didn't ask her about the transfer, didn't reference the agreement, didn't explain the terms or outline her role or make clear in a dozen small, efficient ways that she now belonged to him. He showed her through a corridor lit with iron sconces, pointed out the dining hall, the healer's quarters. "I understand you have some training there," he said, without making it sound like a credential he was cataloguing, and stopped in front of a heavy wooden door near the east wing. He reached into his coat pocket and held something out to her. A key, small silver, worn smooth at the bow from years of handling. She stared at it. "Your room," he said. Justina looked up at him. "Mine. Every person deserves a place that's theirs," he said it simply. Without days became weeks without Justina noticing. That was the strangest part. In Silverfang, she had always been aware of time, measuring it in small, careful increments, tracking how long since Caleb had spoken to her, how many days since he had looked at her with anything resembling warmth. Time in Silverfang had been something to endure. Here, it simply passed. The healer's quarters became her anchor. Nightfall's head healer, an older woman named Sarah, with silver-streaked hair and the efficient, unsentimental manner of someone who had seen everything twice, had accepted Justina's offer of help with a single appraising look and a nod that communicated both "you'll do" and "don't get in my way" simultaneously. Justina didn't get in her way. She restocked shelves, ground-dried herbs, redressed wounds with the quiet precision she had taught herself over years of tending to Silverfang's injured when no one else remembered to. She knew feverwort from moonleaf. She knew how to tell when a set bone was healing clean and when it wasn't. She knew how to sit beside someone in pain without filling the silence with useless noise. Sarah noticed. She didn't say anything for the first week. At the end of the second, she simply moved Justina to the more complicated cases. It was the kindest promotion she had ever received. The children found her on a Thursday. A small girl with mud on her knees, and 2 missing front teeth appeared in the healer's doorway, while Justina was cataloguing a shelf of tinctures, announced that she had a splinter, and held up her palm with the grave authority of someone presenting evidence in a trial. Justina removed it. The girl left. She came back the next day with 2 friends and a scraped elbow between them. By the end of the month, there were usually 3 or 4 children somewhere nearby, orbiting her the way children orbit people who remember their names and ask them questions and actually listen to the answers. She had always been good with children. She was only now beginning to understand that it was because she had never made them feel invisible. Rowan found her in the herb garden on a Tuesday evening, on her knees in the dirt, frowning at a row of silver root that had bolted too early in the unseasonal warmth. He crouched beside her without being asked and studied the plants with the focused attention he brought to most things. Unhurried, genuinely interested. "The soil's too dry on this side," he said. "The drainage from the east wall pulls moisture away from the bed." She looked at him. "You know silver root? My mother grew it." He pulled one of the bolted stems gently, examined the root. She used it for headaches. Swore it worked better than anything Sarah ever made, though she was careful never to say that within earshot. Justina laughed before she meant to, a small surprise sound. Rowan glanced at her sideways, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. They moved the bed together that evening, working in companionable near silence while the light dropped through the trees in long amber shafts. He passed her tools without being asked. She told him which plants could be saved and which couldn't. At some point, the conversation wandered from silverroot to the old growing traditions of the northern packs, and from there, somehow, to whether the Crescent Kingdom's harvest festivals had ever been as large as the old records claimed. "They say the Moon Temple used to host the whole kingdom," Rowan said, brushing soil from his hands. "Every pack, every bloodline, all of them gathered under one roof. What happened to it?" He was quiet for a moment. "The histories don't agree. Some say it fell into disuse when the old bloodlines died out. Some say it was deliberate, that certain alphas found it inconvenient to have a place where power didn't belong to the strongest wolf in the room." Justina looked at the crescent pendant resting against her collarbone. She had worn it since childhood, her mother's. She had never known why she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind when she packed. She didn't say any of that. It sounds like something worth remembering, she said instead. Rowan looked at her. Yes, he said. It does. 300 miles south, the Silver Fang pack house was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Caleb noticed it the way you notice a sound that has stopped, not immediately, but in the accumulation of small absences. The healer's shelf was low and nobody had restocked it. A child had scraped his knee in the courtyard and stood there looking around, uncertain who to go to. The morning meal had been prepared, but nobody had remembered to check whether the youngest betas had eaten. Small things. Invisible things. The kind of things that only became visible once they were gone. He told himself it was a management issue. He assigned tasks. He delegated. He sat in his study with the alliance document spread before him and the quiet pressing in from every wall, and told himself the pack was stable now. The debt was serviced. The border disputes were cooling. He had made the right decision. He almost believed it. He didn't think about her. He was very deliberate about not thinking about her. The fire pit that evening had drawn half the pack into the central yard. Someone had brought out a battered string instrument. Someone else had produced a skin of dark wine, and the general mood was the loose, unhurried ease of people who felt safe enough to simply exist together without agenda. Justina sat near the outer edge of the circle. Rowan appeared beside her at some point and lowered himself onto the log bench without ceremony, close enough to share warmth from the fire. He said something low and terrible about the string player's tuning. She buried her face in her hands and laughed, not politely, not carefully. The real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere unguarded and doesn't ask permission first. It startled her. The sound of her own joy, unmonitored, free. When she looked up, Rowan was watching the fire with an expression she was only beginning to learn how to read. Quiet, careful, like a man storing something away for safekeeping. Neither of them spoke about it. Neither of them stopped thinking about it. She found it on a morning when the fog hadn't lifted by noon. She hadn't been looking for it. That was the part she would struggle to explain later. That she hadn't gone searching, hadn't followed a map or a rumor or anything as deliberate as curiosity. She had simply walked, the way she sometimes did, when the healer's quarters were quiet and the children were in lessons, and the particular stillness of the day felt less like peace and more like pressure. She had walked north, into the older part of the forest where the trees grew so close together their roots surfaced above the ground in tangled knots, and the canopy was dense enough to hold the mist in long silver ribbons between the trunks. And then she had stopped, not because she decided to, because something inside her did, the ruins barely visible beneath 30 years of ivy. If you weren't standing exactly where she was standing, at exactly the angle the weak noon light happened to fall, you would have seen nothing but forest. Old stone swallowed by green, a structure the land was slowly, patiently reclaiming. But she could see the shape beneath it, the arch of a doorway, the suggestion of columns, carved symbols running along a lintel, half obscured by moss, in a script she had never been taught and somehow almost recognized, the way you almost recognize a word in a language you've never studied, the meaning hovering just below the surface of understanding. Her pendant was warm against her sternum. It had never been warm before. She stood at the tree line for a long moment, both hands loose at her sides, the fog pressing gently around her ankles. Then she walked forward. The ivy parted at her touch as though it had been waiting. She told herself later that was only her imagination, that vines don't move for people, that she had simply pushed them aside, the way you push aside anything in your path. She almost convinced herself. The threshold was a single worn step of pale stone. She paused on it, one hand braced against the doorframe, the carved symbols inches from her fingers. Up close they were deeper than they'd appeared, cut with deliberate care into stone that must have once been very white and was now the color of old bone. She crossed the threshold. The world changed. It didn't happen slowly. The moment her foot touched the interior floor, light exploded through the walls. Silver, clean, the particular blue-white of moonlight concentrated into something almost unbearable. Every carved symbol on every surface ignited simultaneously, running with cold fire from floor to ceiling in ribbons that chased each other like water-finding channels. The air pressure dropped and then surged. The stone floor vibrated beneath her feet in a single deep tremor that she felt in her molars, in her chest, in the base of her spine. She didn't run. She didn't know why she didn't run. She stood in the center of it, silver light pouring around her, her red hair lifting on a wind that had no source, her pendant blazing hot against her skin, and she felt, not fear, exactly, something older than fear, something that recognized this, the way your body recognizes your mother's voice before your mind has fully woken. Welcome home, daughter. The voice had no direction. It came from everywhere at once, and from somewhere directly inside her chest, the same place the pressure had been building for weeks, the same place that had gone quiet on the wagon when she'd stopped crying and felt something ancient stir. She pressed both hands flat against her sternum. The light intensified, then, slowly like a tide going out, it settled, dimmed from blinding to luminous. The symbols continued to glow steady and patient, illuminating the interior of the temple in shifting silver. Carved murals emerged from the shadows on the walls. Figures she didn't recognize, a woman standing at the center of each one, arms raised, a crescent blazing above her like a second moon. She was still staring at them when she heard boots on the threshold behind her. Rowan stood in the doorway. He had followed her trail in the forest when she hadn't returned by midday. She learned that later. He had found the parted ivy, the single worn step, the light bleeding through the gaps in the stone walls from 50 yards away. He stood now absolutely still, taking in the glowing symbols, the silver-lit murals, the way the light moved around her and only her, bending toward her slightly, the way iron filings bend toward a magnet, not touching him, not reacting to him at all, only her. His expression was not afraid. It was the expression of a man watching something he has no framework for and choosing very deliberately to stay anyway. Justina, quiet, careful, are you all right? I don't know, she said honestly. He stepped inside. The symbols didn't respond. The light didn't shift. The temple acknowledged him the way it might acknowledge furniture, neutrally, without interest. He came to stand beside her and looked up at the murals, at the woman at the center of each one, at the crescent above her head. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Rowan said very quietly, "There are records in the pack archive, old ones." He paused. "I always thought they were mythology." "What kind of records?" He looked at her pendant, at the crescent on its face, at the way the temple light seemed to recognize it. "A prophecy," he said, "about a bloodline the kingdom forgot, about a woman the moon goddess marked as her own." Justina looked down at her hands. On her left palm, where there had been nothing that morning, a crescent mark blazed silver against her skin. It was still glowing. The archive smelled of beeswax and old leather, and something underneath both of those things that Justina couldn't name, something mineral, like stone after rain, like the inside of the temple itself. Rowan had sent for the elders before they'd even left the forest. By the time she and Rowan returned to the pack house, 3 of them were already waiting in the archive room. Elder Marin, who was the oldest wolf in Nightfall, and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had stopped wasting energy on unnecessary things decades ago. A younger scholar named Pell who wore ink stains on both hands like a permanent accessory, and a woman introduced simply as Thea, who said nothing at all, but looked at Justina's palm for a long, still moment, and then sat down heavily in the nearest chair, as though her legs had decided the matter for her. Justina sat across the long table from them, with her marked hand resting flat against the wood. The crescent had faded to a faint silver outline by then, visible if you were looking, invisible if you weren't, like a scar from something that hadn't hurt. Rowan stood near the window, not presiding, just present. Elder Marin opened the oldest record first. The binding cracked. The pages were the color of weak tea, covered in the same script Justina had seen carved into the temple lintel, that almost familiar language, the one that hovered at the edge of understanding without quite arriving. Marin read in silence for several minutes. Pell pulled a second volume and began cross-referencing, moving his finger down columns of text with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this problem his entire career. Thea still hadn't spoken. Finally, Marin looked up. "Luna Queen Celine," she said, not a question. Justina didn't know the name. She should have. She understood that immediately from the way all 3 elders responded to it, the particular stillness that fell over the room, the way Rowan's posture shifted almost imperceptibly near the window. "Tell me," Justina said. The history came out in pieces, assembled from 3 different records that had never been read together before, because no one had ever had reason to. Luna Queen Celine had been the first ruler of Crescent Kingdom, not the first alpha, not the first dominant wolf, but the first ruler, which was a different thing entirely, chosen directly by the moon goddess, marked with the crescent, possessed of a power the records described in terms that were more poetry than documentation. The light that remembered, the voice the stones answered, the blood that the kingdom was built upon and cannot stand without. She had ruled for 40 years, had chosen a king consort, had built the moon temple as the kingdom's seat of unity rather than dominance, and then she had died, and the alphas had spent the next 3 centuries quietly dismantling everything she'd established, and her bloodline had scattered and thinned and eventually been recorded as extinct by historians who found it convenient. Not extinct, Pell said, not looking up from his page. Dormant, there's a difference. Without her bloodline active, Marin continued, her eyes on Justina. No alpha can hold legitimate royal authority over the whole kingdom. They can rule their own packs. They can form alliances. But the ancient law is clear. She set one finger on the text. The throne of Crescent Kingdom belongs to the blood of Selene. Every claim made without it has been technically provisional. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges things. Every alpha in the kingdom, Rowan said carefully from the window, has been ruling on a provisional claim for 300 years. Yes, Marin said. And the moment word of this spreads, it will already be spreading, Thea said. It was the first thing she had said. Her voice was low and very level. The temple woke Rowan. Half the northern forest saw the light. These things don't stay quiet. 300 miles south, they weren't staying quiet. The rumors reached Silverfang on the third day. Fragmented, unreliable. The kind of story that travels faster than the facts can keep up with. A temple awakened in nightfall territory. Ancient marks appearing. Talk of a chosen one, a bloodline, a prophecy most packs hadn't taken seriously in living memory. Caleb heard it from his head beta over the morning meal and said nothing. He heard it again from a border patrol report that evening and filed it without comment. He told himself it was rumor, the kind of mystical nonsense that circulated every few years when packs were bored or frightened and looking for something to organize their fear around. He had no patience for prophecy. He had run his pack on strategy and strength and hard decisions, and those things were real and they worked, and they had nothing to do with glowing temples and ancient bloodlines. He almost didn't think about her at all when he heard the description. Red hair, an Omega, transferred to Nightfall weeks ago, almost. The pack house was dark and mostly quiet when Rowan found Justina sitting on the steps of the east courtyard, her marked hand turned upward in her lap, studying it in the thin moonlight. He sat beside her without asking. She had stopped being surprised by that. The way he arrived beside her without announcement and without expectation, as though proximity to her was simply somewhere he found himself. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "I don't know what I am." "That seems reasonable." "Does it? You found out tonight that you carry the blood of the woman who built a kingdom." He paused. "I think not knowing what you are is the only sane response." She almost smiled. "What do you think it means? For me, not for the kingdom." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. In the moonlight, his expression was unguarded in the way it sometimes was late at night, when the alpha composure loosened slightly at the edges. "I think," he said slowly, "that it means everything people failed to see in you was real, that it was always real." He stopped. There was more. She could feel it, the shape of something unfinished in the air between them. He didn't say it. Instead, he looked up at the moon, and she looked at her palm, and the unspoken thing settled quietly between them like something that had decided it could wait. It couldn't wait much longer. The first alpha arrived on a Tuesday. He came alone, without retinue, without the ceremonial escort that pack protocol demanded for cross-territory visits. He was old, older than most wolves ever got, his hair fully white, his face carrying the particular weathered calm of someone who had stopped being surprised by most things. He arrived at Nightfall's open gates on foot, gave his name to the border wolves, and asked very quietly to be taken to her. Rowan received him in the main hall. The old alpha looked at Justina across the room, and then he did something no alpha in living memory had done voluntarily, without political pressure or formal ceremony, or the particular calculation of men performing submission for an audience. He knelt, just that. No speech, no declaration. His old knees on the stone floor and his white head bowed, and the absolute silence of a man who had been waiting a very long time to do exactly this. Justina stood very still and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. By the end of the week, there were 7. They came from different directions, different territories, different bloodlines with different histories and different reasons for making the journey north. Some were old, like the first. Some were not. What they shared was the same quality of certainty, the way they looked at her mark, at the temple burning softly in the forest, at the ancient symbols that had not dimmed since the day she crossed the threshold, and recognized something their grandparents' grandparents had only ever described in stories told close to fires. The temple guardians arrived on the 5th day. Justina hadn't known there were still temple guardians. Apparently neither had most of Nightfall. They were a small, silent order that had spent 3 centuries maintaining their vigil in the deep north, on the understanding that one day the vigil would mean something again. They wore grey. They bowed as a unit. Their eldest pressed 2 fingers to Justina's marked palm with the reverent efficiency of someone completing a task they had been specifically designed for. "The chosen is found," she said to no one in particular, and everyone at once. After that, the news stopped being a rumor. Caleb left Silverfang on a moonless night, alone. He told no one where he was going. Left his beater a vague directive about border patrol rotations that would hold things together for 3 days without raising questions. Took the northern road at a pace that was less travel and more controlled anger. 'Cause that was what this was. Anger, not worry. Certainly not the particular hollow unease that had been sitting in his sternum since the rumors started, and he had not thought about her. Had deliberately and repeatedly not thought about her, and kept failing. He was going to expose it. That was what he told himself the entire ride north. Someone was running a fraud. Someone had found a woman with red hair and a convenient birthmark, and was using her to destabilize kingdom politics, to manufacture a claim, to turn a transferred Omega into a political weapon against the packs that held actual power. It was sophisticated, he could admit that. But he had built Silverfang's dominance on seeing through sophisticated things. And he would see through this, and then he would go home. He crossed into nightfall territory at dusk on the second day. He smelled the temple before he saw it. He had expected something he could dismiss. He had expected, if he was honest, to find something small, a modest ruin with some torches arranged for effect, a staged performance for credulous old wolves who wanted to believe in something. He had expected the kind of theatre that collapses the moment someone walks in without reverence and simply looks. The light through the trees was visible from half a mile away, not torchlight, not firelight, something colder and more constant, the blue-white of concentrated moonlight, pouring through the gaps in ancient stone as though the structure itself had been filled with it. He stopped his horse at the tree line. In the clearing before the temple, a gathering had formed, 24 wolves at least, spread in a loose half-circle, their attention directed toward the temple steps. Some standing, some already kneeling. An old female wolf he recognized from the southern territories, who had held her pack for 40 years and bent her head for no one in that entire time, was on one knee with her eyes closed. On the temple steps, surrounded by soft silver light that moved with her rather than simply illuminating her, stood Justina. She was wearing plain dark clothing. Her red hair was loose. She wasn't performing anything, wasn't addressing the crowd, wasn't holding a ceremonial position. She was listening to something the temple guardian beside her was saying, her head slightly bent, her expression carrying that quality of careful attention he had watched her give to injured wolves and small children, and anyone who spoke to her as though their words had weight. She had always listened like that. He had never once taken advantage of it. Beside her, not in front, not behind, not at the correct ceremonial distance that protocol prescribed between an alpha and someone under his protection, stood Rowan Ashwood. Beside her, exactly equal. The sight did something to Caleb's chest that he had no adequate word for. Not jealousy, deeper than jealousy. The specific devastation of watching someone be treated the way they deserve to be treated, and understanding, with the full weight of the comparison, that you were the reason they had never had it before. The mark on her palm caught the temple light and blazed. Real, undeniable, not theatre. He had sold his fated mate. He had sold his future queen. He had sold the only legitimate claim to the throne of Crescent Kingdom, signed it away before sunrise without saying goodbye, and ridden home certain he had made the right decision. He sat on his horse at the tree line for a long time. Around him the forest was very quiet, and for the first time in his life, Alpha Caleb Blackthorne had absolutely nothing to tell himself. He came back 3 weeks later, alone. No warriors at his back, no beta escort, no ceremonial colors or alpha markings. Just a man on a tired horse arriving at Nightfall's open gates in the grey mid-morning light, looking like someone who had not slept well in a very long time. The border wolves recognized him. Word reached Rowan before Caleb had dismounted. Rowan came to Justina's room himself, knocked once. When she opened the door, he looked at her with that steady, unhurried attention of his and said, simply, "Caleb Blackthorne is at the gate. You don't have to see him. That is not a courtesy, it is a fact. Say the word and I'll send him back." Justina was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "I'll see him." Rowan nodded. He didn't ask if she was certain, didn't offer to stand nearby, didn't suggest she might want someone with her. He trusted her to know her own mind, the way he always had, and that trust steadied her more than any reassurance would have. "The temple courtyard," she said, "not inside." Caleb was waiting when she arrived. He looked older than she remembered. Not dramatically, not years in the space of weeks, but in the particular way that guilt ages people when they stop running from it and finally stand still. His jaw was unshaven. His coat was the plain traveling one, not the ceremonial black. He held nothing. His hands were simply at his sides, empty, and that emptiness felt deliberate, like a man who had consciously put everything down before walking through the door. He looked at her, and something moved through his expression that she had spent years hoping to see and no longer needed. Justina, Caleb. The space between them was perhaps 10 feet of pale morning light and about 3 years of accumulated silence. He spoke first. "You look," he stopped himself. Started again. "You're well, I am. The mark." His eyes moved to her left hand, where the crescent rested in its faint silver outline. "I saw it, at the temple." He paused. "I came to see it myself because I needed to was." "Real," she said. "You can say it." "Real," he repeated. The words seemed to cost him something. She waited. "I made a mistake." The words came out flat, like something he had rehearsed until the rehearsal was all that was left. He seemed to know that because he stopped and looked away, and when he looked back, something rawer had replaced the prepared version. I know that's not enough. I know what I did. Do you?" Not hostile, genuinely asking. "I signed a transfer document," he said. "I used pack law to move you like you were something I owned. I didn't say goodbye because I couldn't look at you while I did it. And I told myself that made me practical instead of a coward." His voice tightened. "I told myself you were the thing I could afford to lose." The words landed in the space between them with the particular weight of true things stated too late. Justina absorbed them. She noticed, with some distant interest, that they didn't break anything. That the part of her they would have broken was no longer structured the same way. "You didn't even write my name," she said. "The transfer document. Someone else wrote it. You sent someone else to write my name on the paper that ended my life in Silverfang." She said it without heat, without tears, simply placing the fact between them where it could be seen. "I used to think the worst part was that you didn't choose me. Then I thought the worst part was that you didn't say goodbye. But that was it, Caleb, that you couldn't even be bothered to write my name yourself." His eyes closed briefly. "I know, I loved you," she continued, "for years. I learned your habits and your moods and every version of your silences. And I was careful and patient and invisible, and I told myself that one day you would look up and see me." She paused. "You never did. And when your pack needed something to trade, I was the obvious choice, because I had spent so long making myself easy to overlook that I had become easy to lose." The words weren't an accusation. That was the thing he would remember afterward, that she said all of it without cruelty, without the particular edge of someone drawing blood. She said it the way she said most things, clearly, honestly, because it was true and deserved to be said in the light. Caleb had no defense to offer. He didn't try to construct one. "I came to bring you home," he said. His voice was very quiet. Justina looked at him for a long moment. She waited for the feeling that should have accompanied those words. The old reflex, the years of wanting, the part of her that had measured so much of its hope against the possibility that he would one day come and say exactly this. It wasn't there. Not because she had buried it or was suppressing it or would find it later in a quieter moment. It simply wasn't there. In its place was something she was only beginning to have a word for. A kind of wholeness that had grown slowly in the space the old longing had, vacated, filled in by herb gardens and silver keys and late-night fire pits and a man who remembered the things she said and stood beside her rather than in front. She shook her head. "I am home," she said. The simplicity of it, the absolute unperformed certainty. Caleb stood very still for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the way a man nods when he receives a verdict he deserves and has no grounds to contest. He turned and walked back toward the gate. She watched him go without calling after him. Then she turned toward the temple, where the silver light was already beginning its slow morning glow between the trees, and went to meet the day. Not every alpha knelt. She had known that was coming. Rowan had known it too. She could tell by the way he had begun holding his morning briefings differently in the weeks. After Caleb's visit, the quiet efficiency with which he repositioned Nightfall's senior wolves without ever making it look like preparation for conflict. He was good at that, readying things without alarming them. 3 alphas from the Central Territories arrived together, which was itself a statement. They were younger than the ones who had knelt, powerful, politically aligned, and deeply invested in a kingdom structure that had rewarded them handsomely for 3 centuries. They requested a formal audience. Rowan granted it. They sat across the long table in the main hall and made their case with the polished confidence of men who had decided the outcome before entering the room. The prophecy was mythology. The mark was unverifiable. The bloodline claim was convenient, suspiciously convenient, they noted, for a pack that had recently acquired an unclaimed Omega through a debt transfer and might benefit considerably from elevating her to a throne. No offense intended to anyone present. This was simply the kind of scrutiny any legitimate claim required. They looked at Justina while they said it, not at Rowan, at her, measuring her response, testing whether she would defer, deflect, look to the alpha beside her for guidance. She met each of their gazes in turn, and said nothing until they had finished. "The temple records," she said then, "are available to any scholar you wish to send. Elder Marin will receive them. The bloodline documentation spans 4 volumes and has been cross-verified across 3 separate archives." She paused. "But I understand that isn't really what this is about." A beat of silence. "You're not concerned about legitimacy," she continued, still level, still unhurried. "You're concerned about what legitimacy means for the authority you currently hold." She let that sit for a moment. "Those are different problems. I'm willing to discuss the second one. I'm not willing to manufacture doubt about the first one to make the second one more comfortable." The 3 alphas exchanged a look. The oldest of them leaned forward. "The ancient law requires a trial. If the bloodline is genuine, the heir completes the temple's test." His tone was calibrated, not quite a challenge, not quite an invitation. "Surely a legitimate claimant has nothing to fear from verification." "No," Justina said, "she doesn't." The trial was set for the following morning. She didn't sleep much. Not from fear. She examined the feeling carefully in the dark of her room and found that what she had wasn't fear, but the particular heightened clarity of someone approaching something definitive. A threshold. The last one. Rowan knocked at midnight. She opened the door and he held up 2 cups of something warm. Tea, the kind Sarah made for sleeplessness, with the slightly self-conscious air of a man who had decided to do something and was now slightly uncertain about the execution. She stepped aside to let him in. They sat in the 2 chairs by the window the way they had sat beside fires and in herb gardens and on courtyard steps, companionably without agenda. Close enough that the warmth between them was mutual and neither of them pretended otherwise. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "No." She turned the cup in her hands. "I think I've been walking toward this since the wagon left Silverfang, maybe longer." She looked at him sideways. "Are you afraid?" Something shifted in his expression. Not the space between them, which had been narrowing by degrees for months, through herb gardens and fire pit evenings and late-night conversations and all the accumulated small moments of a man consistently, deliberately choosing to see her. Closed. "Rowan, I know the timing is." She set down her cup. "Stop being careful." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with a simplicity that matched the rest of him, "I love you. I have loved you since you laughed at a terrible joke about string instruments and looked startled by the sound of your own happiness." A pause. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I just wanted you to know, before tomorrow, that whatever happens in that temple, you are already everything the prophecy says you are. You were before the mark. You were before any of this." Justina looked at him, at the steadiness of him, the particular quality of his attention, the way he had just said the most important thing he'd ever said to her, and was now simply waiting, without pressure, without expectation, because that was who he was. "I know," she said softly. "I love you too." The trial required no performance. She crossed the temple threshold at dawn, with the 3 skeptical alphas watching from the tree line alongside every wolf who had gathered over the past weeks. The temple responded the way it always responded to her, immediate, total, the silver light flooding every carved surface the moment her foot touched the interior floor. But this time something more happened. At the center of the temple floor, a circle of ancient symbols she had never seen active before ignited in sequence, one by one, a slow spiral of cold fire moving inward toward the center. She walked toward it without being instructed. She stood inside it when she reached it. The voice came from everywhere. Not words this time, just light, a pulse of it, silver-white, that moved outward from her in a wave that rolled through the walls and the stone and out into the forest and kept going. And every wolf present felt it pass through them like a held breath finally released. When it cleared, the crescent on her palm was blazing. Above her head, suspended in silver light, a crown of woven moonstone had assembled itself from nothing. Outside, she heard the sound of knees meeting earth. She looked across the temple at Rowan, standing in the doorway where the light touched him at its edges. He smiled. Not the smile of a man watching power consolidate, the smile of a man watching someone he loves finally receive what they were always owed. She walked toward him, and the crown came with her, and the kingdom outside was already kneeling. The great assembly had not been called in 300 years. The valley below the Moon Temple had been chosen for it, wide enough to hold thousands, ringed by old-growth forest on three sides, the temple itself visible on the rise above like a second dawn. Packs arrived over the course of 3 days, setting their banners in the earth alongside rivals they had spent generations measuring themselves against. There was tension in it, and history, and the particular strange electricity of people who have been handed an occasion larger than their grievances and are deciding slowly whether to rise to it. By the morning of the assembly, the valley was full. Justina stood at the temple's upper threshold and looked down at it, at the banners and the fires and the thousands of wolves gathered in the early light, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not fear, not the performance of courage that she had seen powerful men wear at moments. Like this, that particular set of the jaw that announced, "I am not afraid," to anyone watching. Something quieter, something that had been growing in her since a morning when she had woken to a sealed envelope and the cold side of a bed and the absolute silence of a man who had already decided and had simply slowly, over months of silver keys and herb gardens and late-night honesty, become solid enough to stand on. Rowan appeared beside her. He had been doing that for 8 months now, and it still steadied her in a way she no longer tried to diminish or explain away. "Ready?" he asked. She looked at him. Yes. She walked down alone. That had been her decision, and Rowan had honored it without question, understanding, as he usually did, the difference between support and overshadowing. He would be there when she finished. That was enough. That had always been enough. The crowd parted as she came through it, not with the performed deference of people managing a powerful stranger, with something older and less calculated, a reflex, like the way you step back from the edge of something that commands your attention without demanding it. She climbed the assembly stone at the valley's center. The valley went quiet. She didn't speak like a queen reclaiming a throne. She spoke like herself, clearly, without theater, in the same voice she used when she sat beside someone in pain and told them the truth about what was happening and what came next. "I am not here to take power from you," she said. The valley's acoustics carried it without effort, the way her temple carried her voice, as though the land itself had been built for this frequency. "I am not here to replace one set of dominance with another and call it restoration. The kingdom does not need another ruler who measures worth by strength and silence, and the willingness to sacrifice whoever is easiest to lose." A stillness in the crowd, the particular stillness of people recognizing something. "The kingdom you inherited," she continued, "was built on the understanding that leadership is service. That authority is borrowed from the people who consent to it, and returned to them in the form of safety and dignity and the right to choose their own lives." She paused. Somewhere in 300 years, that understanding became inconvenient. It got set aside, and the people it was set aside for, the ones without power, without territory, without the luxury of being the strongest wolf in any given room, they absorbed the cost of that in silence, because silence was the only option they were given. She looked out across the valley. "That ends now, not because I command it, because you are going to remember what you already know about what it means to lead something worth leading." The first alpha knelt at the assembly stone's base. She recognized him, one of the 3 who had demanded the temple trial, the oldest of them, the one who had framed the challenge with the careful language of scrutiny rather than opposition. He knelt slowly, with the deliberate weight of a man making a choice rather than performing a surrender, and kept his eyes on her while he did it. Then the alpha beside him, then another, further back in the crowd. It moved through the valley like the wave of light that had moved through the temple, not a command, not a pressure, but a recognition traveling from one wolf to the next as each one made the same private calculation and arrived at the same answer. She didn't watch it sweep the crowd, she watched Caleb. He was standing near the eastern edge of the assembly, alone the way he had arrived at Nightfall's gates 3 weeks ago. He had not spoken to her again after that morning, in the temple courtyard. He had simply come, to the assembly, to the valley, to this moment, and stood in it the way a man stands in the consequences of his own choices, when he has finally stopped trying to negotiate his way out of them. When the valley had nearly stilled, when almost every alpha in the Crescent Kingdom was on one knee, Caleb lowered himself to the earth, not with theater, not with the visible performance of a powerful man demonstrating humility for an audience, quietly, finally, like setting something down that he had been carrying too long. Tears tracking silently down his face, she looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away, gently, The way you look away from someone's private grief to give it the dignity of not being witnessed. The mating ceremony was small. Just the temple and the elders and the wolves of nightfall who had become her people, and the moon goddess's light doing what it had been doing since the first morning. Justina crossed the threshold, recognizing her, answering her, illuminating everything she already was. Rowan stood beside her, exactly beside. When the elder pronounced them bonded under the ancient law, the temple blazed silver from floor to ceiling, and the crescent on Justina's palm and the matching mark that had appeared on Rowan's the morning after the trial blazed together, and the whole forest seemed to exhale. Years later, the temple gardens were full of children. They came every morning, from nightfall, from visiting packs, eventually from every corner of the kingdom, because the gardens were open to everyone, and because the Moon Queen had made it known from the first week of her reign that children were permitted everywhere she was permitted, which was everywhere. Rowan found her there on a morning that looked like all the other mornings, and was therefore perfect, sitting on the low stone wall with a child on each side of her and a third one asleep in the grass at her feet, the pale early light coming through the old trees in long gold shafts, her red hair loose, her marked hand resting warm in his when he sat beside her. "The northern delegates arrive tomorrow," he said. "I know, and the Silverfang Treaty Review. I know that too." He looked at her sideways. She was smiling at the sleeping child in the grass, unhurried, entirely present, the way she was present for all of it. The politics and the ceremonies and the hard decisions and the quiet mornings, with the same quality of attention, the same fullness of self. She had once been the woman waiting to be chosen. Now she was the queen who had finally chosen herself. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.